Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I want to send you loads and loads of love, and I do hope that you're about to have the most phenomenal day, because I don't know what your time zone is, but whether it's daytime or evening, I hope you're going to settle down to enjoy this really lovely story with a lovely hot cup of coffee or tea or cocoa, whatever it is you drink. So let's get started. But before we do, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Chantel and I'm initially from Pennsylvania, but my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in 1978 when I was only 15 years old at the time, and my family had moved to a small rural town in the Pacific Northwest. My father had been offered an amazing job running a dairy farm for a farmer who'd been paralysed from the waist down from a dreadful accident where his tractor had accidentally rolled over his torso. It was a horrifying ordeal, and he was lucky to be alive. Ralph the farmer was zealously enthusiastic about all his cows, despite his disabling condition, and he wanted nothing better than to preserve his farm. So he hired my father, who was being paid handsomely, to take charge of his dairy herd and to manage the business on his behalf, and his delightful wife Patsy was now relegated to being a full-time carer on the farm, giving her husband, Ralph, the full-time care that he actually needed, and she was desirous for nothing more than to take care of him, because she absolutely loved the bones of him. My dad loved nothing better than getting his hands really dirty, and had always revelled in the great outdoors and was fervently passionate about cows. Growing up as a young boy, his grandfather had owned a large dairy farm, so there was nothing that fired him up more than working with cows, and as a young boy he had known everything there was to know about running a dairy farm, which he had aspired to do all his young life. However, his own parents had their own fanciful, bright ideas for their son's future, and imposed their indomitable will on him, as well as actively encouraging, persuading, and unrelentingly bullying my father to embrace the corporate world, which was not in his blood at all. I think his pertinacious parents falsely believed that there was no future in dairy farming, and that real money was to be made behind a desk in the office. Little did they realise how wrong they were to impose their idealistic views and principles on my father. My father quite literally despised and detested every minute of office life, and dreaded getting up early in the morning to go to the office that was so devoid of cheerful birdsong in the valley, and the fresh air blowing against his face. One day he decided that he could not stand another day in an office inundated with telephone calls, faxes, urgent messages, officers' lunches, and copious amounts of coffee to calm down his frazzled nerves. As you can imagine, I was devastated to be leaving behind all my amazing friends and my school, as were both my two sisters, Polly 13 and Annabelle, who was 12. But we all knew how thrilled both my parents were about embarking upon this exciting adventure with a brand new life in the countryside, so we chose to embrace this great opportunity with a very positive, upbeat attitude. The short-term temporary plan was that we were to move into a rural neighbourhood and buy a house there, which we would eventually sell. The long-term outlook was that we were going to build our brand new dream farmhouse, emerald green rolling hills. On the opposite side of our street was a high grassy embankment, which stretched out into a wide open clearing, which was then flanked by a vast area of natural forest that literally stretched back for miles. These forests consisted of towering, majestic Douglas and vine maples, as well as Pacific, silver and grand fir trees, and it was also teeming with an abundance of indigenous wildlife to the area, like the typical mule and white-tailed deers that we would see looking in at us from the edges of the forest, and sometimes we would see them early in the morning on the green outside our homes, scampering around. I remember we were unpacking and unloading large cardboard boxes filled with kitchen crockery that we were subsequently placing in the kitchen cabinets. We were chattering excitedly among ourselves, and our elevated voices were raised in animated childlike enthusiasm about our exciting move. Suddenly I looked out of the window and saw a crotchety-looking man standing only yards away from our window with a huge crabby scowl planted on his wrinkled face. He was shaking his white head of thinning hair with a very evident look of disapproval and exasperated frustration. I sensed almost immediately that he was not pleased with our excited, animated, enthusiastic screams, but I do not believe we had been that raucous or loud, but clearly he begged to disagree. My mother observed this grumpy-looking cantankerous man as she glanced out of the kitchen window that overlooked the front yard and the long stretch of green lawn outside all the properties of our street. As she unwrapped the crockery from the layers of newspaper and placed it into the kitchen cabinet, I remember her saying to us, "That must be our new next-door neighbour," she sighed. "Oh dear, he does look like a crusty, miserable old sod, doesn't he?" I thought personally that he was very creepy, and he had a thin, scrawny, chicken-like legs and an extended stomach overhang, and he looked like he was in his early 60s, but his small, squished-up eyes looked exactly like a bull terrier's, and he was equally as unfriendly and vicious-looking towards strangers. That was clear to me. This morose man just stood there goggling and gawking at us through the kitchen window, and he didn't seem concerned or perturbed that he was being so rude and invasive towards us. He looked just like a barn owl regarding a mouse. It really was an awkward feeling to be so scrutinised so intently by this neighbour. Finally he stopped goggling us and boldly pounded on our front door with 3 very menacing loud raps that sounded as sinister and airy as something out of a horror movie. My mother answered the door to this horrible, surly-looking man. I noticed that he was still scowling and looking decidedly churlish. "I'm your neighbour," he said, "and I live next door. I'd appreciate your children lowering the volume and tone of their voices. This is a quiet neighbourhood, and the residents here do not appreciate children screaming and making a ruckus commotion." "Of course," said my mother. "I'm very sorry. My children are just a little excited and animated, that's all. I didn't realise they were being that noisy." "Mind that you keep the noise down," said the man, and he stomped away like an angry bull. "I told you he was a gloomy sod," sighed my mother. "Just our luck to end up living next door to the old codger. I've got a funny feeling that this isn't the last that we've heard from him. I think he's not going to be plain sailing living next door to someone as waspish and as snappy as he is. I think a hammerback shark would be instantly preferable to him and friendlier than he is. Oh, he is decidedly odd, I'll give him that, and very cold." Fast forward a few weeks and we had settled down superbly into our brand new home, and life was remarkably good. My mother had literally transformed our dwelling into a sumptuous, cosy, congenial den, and had wallpapered and painted the interiors, and it was beginning to feel very snug and homely indeed. I'd also never seen my father happier and more jubilant in his entire life, and even the pale skin that he had developed a golden hue from all the time he spent basking in the warm rays of the sun. I could see that he was in his element. I noticed he'd get up at the crack of dawn to drive his Dodger to the dairy farm, and all the conversations around our dinner table were all about cows. And when my father talked about his dairy herd, I'm not kidding when I say that his face became animated and jubilant. I'd never seen him so vivacious, lively, and passionate about anything before, and his joyful countenance was literally infectious, creating a warm, cosy, happy atmosphere in our home. My mother was so used to the city that she began to settle down into country life like a duck to water, as if she'd never ever been apart from it. She was in her element growing vegetables in the backyard, which was something she'd never ever done before, and watching the seeds develop into plants was something that she marvelled and admired. We were benefiting greatly from the fruits of my father's industrious, copious labourers by drinking the most delicious creamy milk I've ever tasted, and we had phenomenal homemade butter and cheese. It didn't get better than that. In our spare time, my sister and I would ride our bikes down the road, and we would also play in the woods with Fido and Chloe, our 2 cocker spaniels. I began to really cherish life in the countryside, because it was so remarkable. There was one exception, of course, and that was our crotchety old neighbour, that every time we would fly past him, tinkering our bicycle bells, I'd hear him say, "Bloody children, those bloody children," and I'd always shout out, "I heard you, I heard you, I know what you said." It wasn't long before we started receiving pieces of paper with magazine words cut out and stuck on the paper posted through our letterbox, very, very suspiciously. The letters would read, "Shut up or ship out for good." Then another time we would receive a note that read, "If your kids do not shut up, I'll shut them up for you and for good." We all knew that those nasty notes that kept invading our lives like a deadly virus were from that horrible next-door neighbour of ours, but my mother chose to ignore them and told us not to worry about it. "He's just an old codger," she said. The worst he can do is call the police, and you're not making a lot of noise, so there's not much that they can do. I imagine the nasty man absolutely loathes children. Perhaps he's never had kids of his own. Or perhaps he just hates people in general. You do get people like that, you know. One day on our doorstep we found several bottles of Coca-Cola, and my mother brought them all in, believing that they'd accidentally been left in the car after a shopping trip, and that my father had left them on our doorstep for us to put away in the pantry. One dinner my sister got some of those bottles of Coke out from the pantry to have with our dinner. I remember we were eating roast chicken, roast potatoes, gravy, vegetables and cauliflower cheese. My mother was a really good cook, and we always sat around the kitchen table together for dinner every single night. I remember taking a sip of the Coke and saying, "It's a little flat," and I hated flat Coke, so I just did not drink it at all, but opted for some creamy chocolate milk instead. My sisters, on the other hand, were enjoying their Cokes that appeared to have been carbonated, but within 30 minutes after drinking those Cokes, both my sisters became incredibly ill. At first my mother began to worry that there was something wrong with the chicken she had cooked, but the rest of the family was fine, so it couldn't have been what we'd eaten. Annabelle was vomiting, and she was groggy and speaking with a slurred speech, sounding exactly like someone who'd just got a stroke. And my other sister, Polly, was so lacking in coordination and was literally falling all over the place and couldn't stand up straight. She was complaining bitterly that her stomach was hurting and she wanted to throw up. My mother knew immediately that something was intrinsically wrong with both of my sisters. I remember they were taken to the hospital by ambulance and literally rushed there. I still recall our grumpy neighbour watching my two sisters being rolled into the back of the ambulance onto the stretchers, and I recall that the miserable old codger of a next-door neighbour was actually smiling from ear to ear, which made me sick to my stomach. I was so disgusted that he was delighting in my sister's misfortune. Over the next few days, things got progressively worse for my sisters, as the doctors could not understand what was wrong with them, because their bodies appeared to be shutting down. It was one of the most harrowing and anguishing times of our entire life, as my parents thought that they were going to lose their children, and I thought I was going to lose both of my sisters, who were my best friends. One of the very intuitive, on-the-ball doctors, I'm glad to say, decided to run some tests for poisoning, and then they discovered traces of glycolic acid and formaldehyde in their bodies, which they believed were from antifreeze. The police were called to investigate the case immediately, and they literally raided our pantries, testing every conceivable product for antifreeze that we possessed in our entire home. The antifreeze was finally discovered in one of the Coca-Cola bottles that was still remaining. My mother remembered the Coca-Cola that she discovered on the doorstep, and also talked to the police about the insidious notes that we had been posted by our nasty neighbour, who clearly had an axe to grind with us, because that was the thing the police wanted to know. Was there someone who wished us harm? And actually the only person that we could think about was our grumpy neighbour. After these revelations, the police investigated our neighbour's house, and they found bottles of antifreeze in his store cupboards and other Coke bottles he had tampered with, which were poisoned with antifreeze that he was probably intending on using on us later. He had surreptitiously poisoned all the bottles of Coke, as he was desirous to kill us all, and he never believed he'd ever get caught, which was amazing. I still remember the day he was arrested by that police. He was spitting on the ground at my mother and I, as we watched him being dragged, kicking and protesting angrily to the police car. "I wish I'd killed the lot of you," he spouted. "The whole bloody lot of you." It was discovered that this was not the first time our nasty neighbour had attempted to kill people with antifreeze, so my mother was right. He didn't just have a vendetta against children, he also hated people. It was discovered that the deaths of 2 of his previous wives had been deemed very suspicious and had presented with similar symptoms to both of my sisters, but as the formaldehyde had not been discovered in their systems, our neighbour had literally got away with murdering them quite easily without ever being detected. But I'm glad to say his duplicitous acts finally caught up with him, as invariably they usually will. While my sisters were in hospital, it was a tumultuous time for my parents, who were so wrapped up in worry and concern over my sisters that I began to feel very discluded, isolated, lonely and estranged. As a result, I began to spend copious amounts of time in the woods. Every day, much to the delight of my rambunctious cocker spaniels, I would take them for a long walk and play with them with a ball around the stream that meandered through the woods. It was such an enchanting idyllic spot in the woods, and the pebbly stream, dotted with some sculptural-looking rocks, possessed a swift current that literally jetted through the valley. I enjoyed dangling my feet in the cool water and listening to the lovely crashing sounds of the water thundering against the rock, trying to be friendly to strangers. But Chloe was usually the gregarious, uninhibited one. On this occasion it was Fido that was very amenable towards the stranger that was throwing sticks to him, but it was the flamboyant, boisterous Chloe that usually wasn't afraid of anyone that appeared to be keeping her distance. Fido clearly loved this elusive, somewhat mysterious stranger, whoever they were, who appeared to be keeping their distance from me as well, I noticed. The flamboyant Chloe appeared to be far less forthcoming. I didn't know what to think. Was it not rude for a stranger to interfere with a game that you were playing with your dogs, I wondered in surprise. Why was this stranger keeping such a distance and not introducing themselves to me? I watched the stick go flying towards Fido, who scuttled towards the stick and sprinted back towards the stranger with his jaws once again clutching the stick, which invariably I knew he would drop at the stranger's feet for him to throw again. I knew that was happening because that's how Fido always played the game. He was a very intelligent dog. I watched his tail wagging so exuberantly, and he was making the most delighted yaps that I've never heard him make before. I noticed when he kept returning to collect with the stick, he stank to high heaven as if he'd been rolling in something unmentionable and disgusting. It smelt a little bit like cheesy trainers. Every time Fido went back to the stranger to return the stick, I would hear this very strange chattering sound that sounded exactly like a monkey. It was very odd. I remember that I just couldn't understand what it could be. I immediately got up in awe and followed Fido towards the stranger, as curiosity finally had got the better of me, and I wanted to see who this person actually was. I was surprised to see that Chloe was keeping her distance, and her tail was hanging between her legs, as if she was extremely afraid, and I'd never seen her behave this subservient before. When I did approach the stranger, I could not believe what I was actually seeing. This was no human being that was throwing Fido sticks, but a huge hairy creature that looked like a human, only it was covered completely with hair, and it did have a distinct ape-like look to it as well. Body shape and face were definitely human, but there were those discrepancies. You see, the giant-like body of this creature was quite literally colossal. I'm not exaggerating when I say this creature towered at about 10 foot tall, and maybe even over 1,000 pounds, and 5 feet wide, and that's not exaggerating. It really was like meeting King Kong face to face. The creature also possessed very long arms that are so typical of the primate species. Every part of this creature's body was literally thick, burly, sinewy and muscular. It was covered from head to toe with long hazelnut hair, similar in colour to a chocolate Labrador. I did notice that the creature did have a very distinctive bullet-shaped head, very huge shoulders, and no visible neck to speak of. And its hairless face was human-like and leathery, and it had slim lips, a flat nose, very prominent brow ridge, and deep-set golden brown eyes that twinkled with a warm energy that was very captivating. I don't know why the creature looked so surprised to see me, but it actually did. It had been throwing sticks for my dog, which certainly got my attention, so why was it surprised that I went to check out who he was? The creature had a very warm demeanour and a friendly countenance, but it was desperately shy. I could tell it adored Fido, and the feeling was quite clearly mutual. He even ruffled Fido's hair in front of me with a very affectionate way, and he threw the stick for him, and I watched Fido go tearing after the stick. Suddenly Chloe came into view, and she appeared to be very reluctant and retiring, and she didn't like the idea of getting close to that hairy humanoid at all. So the creature instead lunged towards Chloe with such affection and confident boldness. I watched in awe as it ruffled Chloe's hair very affectionately, and before I knew it, this hairy creature was throwing sticks for Chloe as well, and she was in her element, forgetting her former reluctance for approaching the creature. Gone was the reluctant Chloe, and the exuberant, enthusiastic, rambunctious creature was now bounding around happily after those sticks. I suppose looking back I should have been terrified by this incredible creature, because it would have taken nothing for him to snap my neck if he'd wanted to. He was, without doubt, an apex predator. He was powerful, majestic, strong and lofty. I imagine even the bobcats and mountain lions would have given him a wide berth. I knew instinctively I could trust this creature. How, I don't know why. Perhaps it was the human way he interacted with my dogs, and the way that both my dogs just trusted him so implicitly and were besotted over him. I was soon to realise that he was clearly a likeable character, and even I began to warm to him and feel comfortable in his presence, and he began to warm to me, I'm glad to say. I've never met a human that both my animals loved as much as they loved this extraordinary, mysterious creature. Every day we went to the woods, and I would throw sticks with this hairy creature. My animals just loved it. I tried to tell my parents about the hairy creature in the woods that loved our dogs and enjoyed playing in the woods with us, and my parents were so preoccupied with my sister's recovery and slow progress that I remember my mother saying, "Lovely, dear, how nice." And when I told my father, he was even more vague, and he said, "Well, sweetheart, I'm sure he's a very nice man, but you shouldn't judge someone for having a lot of body hair. It can be a condition, you know." I would tell that neither my parents had ever been listening to a word I said, so I never told anyone else about the strange creature I encountered in the wood. Nobody was interested anyway. To cut a long story short, I'm delighted to tell you that both my sisters made a startling, miraculous recovery from that dreadful poisoning they incurred, and they had no long-lasting negative effects from the disastrous episode with the Coca-Cola, which by negative association they've never been able to drink again. Sadly, we sold our house, and I say sadly because I loved going into the woods and playing with the hairy humanoid. But we moved to a dream, newly built farmhouse in the country where my father managed the dairy herd for his paralysed boss. Sadly, his boss did die 5 years after we moved into the farm, but he did leave our entire family the farm because he wanted the dairy farm to go on thriving long after his death. He loved those cows. He knew that my dad was as passionate about the cows as he had been. My family never looked back because my father was in his absolute element managing our dairy farm, which, believe it or not, I still live in all these years later, on the original farmhouse that was occupied by Ralph, the dairy farmer himself. I do remember when we moved to our farm, my 2 Cocker Spaniels did miss our hairy friend almost as much as I did, and they pined for him so terribly. Finally, I did take them back to the woods, but I think he'd moved on by then, because we never ever saw him again, and my dogs were bitterly disappointed. All these long years later, I realised that the creature I encountered in the woods was a Bigfoot, a hairy man, the Yeti or Sasquatch. I realised that in about the year 2006, when I watched a programme on television called Finding Bigfoot, and I saw how difficult and challenged they were to find the creature that I encountered, and I became very excited because I knew that my dogs and I had had a very special encounter with that hairy humanoid. Well, that is the end of the story, and I just want to say thank you so very much. It was a phenomenal story, and it's just horrifying to think that a next-door neighbour would just be so awful that he would actually try and kill you with antifreeze in your Coca-Cola. But you do get people like that, people who just hate human beings. And it wasn't because you were children. He'd done it to his own wives. He'd actually killed them and got away with it, and he thought he could do it to you as well. So I'm very glad you're alive and well and thriving. And what an extraordinary encounter with a Bigfoot. And to think that your dogs warmed to him so much, because animals really know how to detect energy. And if your dogs loved him, then he was one special Bigfoot. That I am sure of. Until next time, goodbye and good night.